hello to all our colleagues. Well, dear colleagues, I would like to share with you in a few words how COVID-19 changed the world. The illness has affected nearly every aspect of life. The years 2020-21 were defined by the coronavirus pandemic, arguably the worst pandemic the world has seen in 100 years. COVID-19 has caused more than 179 million cases and 3.87 million deaths worldwide. The illness has affected nearly every aspect of life, from work and school to everyday activities, like getting groceries and even our wardrobes. Here are just some of the ways COVID-19 changed the world in 2020 and 2021. A number of new words and phrases entered the general lexicon in 2020. We were told we need to social distance or stay 6 feet apart so that we could flatten the curve or slow the disease's spread in order to reduce the burden on the healthcare system. People even become familiar with relatively obscure epidemiological terms like the basic reproduction number, or the average number of people who catch the virus from a single infected person. And of course, the name of the illness itself, COVID-19, is a new term with the World Health Organization officially naming the disease on February 11th last year. The must-have fashion item of 2020 was a small piece of cloth to put around your face. With medical masks in short supply at the beginning of the year, sewing enthusiasts began to make homemade masks for their communities. Then clothing companies and retailers got on board, adding masks to their fashion lines. Now, in many parts of the world, you can't leave your house without putting on a mask. At first, it was unclear whether wearing cloth masks would protect against COVID-19. But as the year went on, numerous studies showed the benefits of wearing masks for both the wearer and those around them. The pandemic took a serious toll on people's mental health in 2020. One study published by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention found that levels of anxiety, depression, and suicidal thought skyrocketed amid the pandemic. The study could not determine the reason for the rise in mental health conditions, but factors relating to the pandemic, such as social isolation, school and university closures, unemployment, and other financial worries, as well as the threat of the disease itself, may play a role, the authors said. Another insidious side effect of the pandemic was increases in alcohol consumption. A study published in the journal JAMA Network Open found that alcohol consumption in the United States rose 14% during pandemic shutdowns. Women in particular reported worrying increases in heavy drinking during the spring of 2020, according to the study. In addition to a range of negative physical health associations, excessive alcohol use may lead to or worsen existing mental health problems, the authors concluded. As businesses began to open after initial lockdowns, people needed to adjust to a new normal to reduce the risk of spreading the disease from everyday activities. Businesses implemented universal mask policies. Dining switched to outdoors only. Waiting rooms became a thing of the past. You needed a reservation to go to the gym, and large gatherings and events were banned completely in many areas. This paper, or these words, were originally published in the Life Science by Rachel Redner. And now on the ICOM Solidarity Project 2021, Clothing the Pandemic, Resiliency, Community, and Unity expressed through an international collaboration of the COVID-19 Face Mask Project. This research and digital exhibition project aims to document and contextualize the use of face masks during the coronavirus pandemic of 2020-21. Face masks have become the iconic object and symbol of the pandemic, representing humanity's resilience, community, and unity during this global tragedy. The project will connect international museums and curators working on this topic and connect their collections virtually to a global public. The stories of COVID-19 will be recorded in all the world's history books. In a similar way, this project intends to preserve and explore the iconic object of this challenging pandemic since its very beginnings, the face mask. These face masks are implicated in a wide range of facets of society, from health, fashion, and art, to politics, identity, and sustainability. It is important for museums and the public to have a broader understanding of textile and dress collecting relating to the pandemic. I would like to invite now Serena Newmark, a PhD candidate from Freie Universität Berlin, Germany, to present her paper, The Creation of an Online Art and Design Reference Library, Information Seeking and Sharing Among Mask Makers.
It's difficult to think back to those first few scary weeks of the COVID-19 pandemic, when we learned that we would soon have to start wearing a protective face mask, an accessory that most of us had never worn before. Like many who have some experience sewing, I dusted off my sewing machine, scoured my home for fabric, and sat down to make something to keep my family safe. As the weeks went on and life continued in a world now adapting to pandemic safety restrictions, two things became apparent. Firstly, a tremendous amount of innovation and artistic excellence could be seen in the development of mask making, and museums and art journalists began examining how we're going to collect and preserve representative and distinctive examples of homemade masks. Secondly, many innovative and artistic masks were the ones made locally and on a small scale, and mask making, often at its most innovative, existed outside of what we think of as the traditional art market or even a traditional craft market. These innovative mask makers masks were created with the spirit of radical community service and a desire on the part of the maker to be of use during this globally difficult time. Long ago, as an undergraduate art history student, I had learned about the method of art historical research described as practices research, and learned from art historians who started their careers as painters. But as I am a hopeless artist myself, I was tremendously surprised to find that I had unwittingly begun practice as research as a mask maker turned mask art historian. I started to come up with an academic framework to analyze and hopefully record the existence, the importance, and the aesthetics of COVID-19 face masks. I wanted to know how the vast amount of written material, online and offline, fit into established ideas of an art history reference library. How is mask making being taught and learned? How is it being adapted with immediate effect by people around the world? I was particularly interested in what appeared to be a spontaneously created online personal protective equipment reference library. Is it possible to have an art library without an art librarian? Years ago, I spent my 9-to-5 behind the reference desk at the libraries of the Museum of Fine Arts Houston. This image of the reference desk at the Hirsch Library is still on the museum's website. That's me there in the pink blouse, next to the reference librarian, who was then training me in conducting the reference desk interview. Across websites put up by designers and health organizations and newly created meeting and exhibition spaces on social media, the reference desk interview at the online reference desk is carried out constantly and largely successfully. Step one of the reference desk interview is establishing a welcoming presence online, welcoming reference presence. In the museum library, it's marked on museum masks with a sign at the door. The online art and design mask library doesn't have a physical reference presence, but it is nonetheless very easy to find. Mask making instructions can be found on websites of fabric stores, on hospital websites, printed in mainstream online news sites, and all across social media. I first learned to make a mask from a video created by Deaconess Hospital in Indiana that was posted on an online mainstream news publication. A member of my local sewing circle, Sundown Greger, said her first step was going directly to social media, specifically YouTube. I spoke to a veteran employee of YouTube, and she said that although YouTube did not purposefully set out to create a space for mask makers, that these communities often rise organically on Facebook and YouTube and other social media, since they're websites where virtually anyone can publish and provide feedback. She also introduced me to a new term, niche influencer, someone who can become very important very quickly via social media in a specific area. And because they often interact with followers and commenters, they can be far more influential than a celebrity or an established brand. In addition to collective spaces on social media, those wanting information on how to make a mask could consult independent fashion designers who also post tips for making homemade masks, as well as providing cost-free PDF patterns that can be printed at home. These designers often serve as niche influencers and use social media to publicize their patterns. The second step of the reference desk interview is to gather information from the user. What is their question? In the online mask library, there's typically only one primary reference question, specifically, how do I make a mask? As in the physical library, most patrons can find the answer themselves. But for those who require assistance, there are the comment sections of websites and YouTube, as well as Instagram and Twitter, which are often filled with mask makers happy to help solve problems collectively. The third step of the reference desk interview is listening, confirming, and refining the question. Patrons of the online mask library often have straightforward questions that can be answered quickly and easily, but sometimes the questions are more complex and concern anxieties about life during a pandemic. Often the question is about how to make a mask for someone who will not, for any number of reasons, be able to wear a mask made from one of the patterns already readily available. The fourth step of the reference desk interview is searching for materials. In the physical art library, this process may start with materials that immediately spring to the mind of an experienced reference desk assistant and continues with the searching of various databases. In the online mask library, questions are answered by frequently dozens of effective librarians. Often answers are repetitive, which, while redundant, can serve to confirm a general consensus that is often helpful for those asking. Designers and mask makers, professional and amateur, will often offer links to patterns or videos on their own external websites. The fifth and last step of the reference desk interview, welcoming feedback and follow-up, is often the most challenging one for physical art libraries. In this regard, the online reference library has it much easier, as social media algorithms constantly direct users back to spaces of previous interest. The concept of peer-to-peer interaction and assistance is certainly not new. Retailers and manufacturers have been encouraging peer-to-peer assistance for years. But while these methods of communication, of information seeking and information creating behaviors are well established, even in the realm of home sewing, they were employed by millions of brand new users with absolutely breakneck speed when the pandemic began. As an art historian, I've also been searching for ways to understand how pandemic face masks, particularly the most remarkable examples, might fit into the concept of what we define as art history and material culture. While folk art is the term that first comes to mind, it's far from accurate. For one, there are several professional fashion designers who've become involved in mask making, and by publishing their designs online, they are serving to train others, not just through videos, photographs, and written instructions, but also by interacting directly with mask makers who are still learning. In the coronavirus era, with so many universities, conference, and museum lectures going fully online, there's no standing to insist an education is less than, merely because it does not involve a packed lecture hall and a laser pointer. So folk art is not quite the correct term, but neither is the traditional relationship of artist, patron, and client. Masks do not fit neatly into the concept of fashion history, as the hand of the artist is consciously erased. We do not really see labels on masks. There is no self-portrait of Ghiberti on the Baptiste doors or Jan van Eyck's Als ik kan. While many individuals have served as donors in the purchase of masks and mask-making supplies, we also do not really see the presence of donors. Their names are found on no museum walls, nor are they seen in a painting visiting the infant Christ. Masks are also absolutely the opposite of art for art's sake. They are created to save lives. And yet the aesthetics, and sometimes even the talismanic qualities of their materials, are in no way secondary to their purpose, and instead absolutely critical for their success. To illustrate these information-seeking and creative behaviors, I will present 3 case studies. These include a niche mask creator whose masks have been taken into museum collections, a pattern designer who has shared her pattern widely, and a large group that has mobilized to sew masks for others. Sunni Delilah is an academically trained British fashion designer with a master's degree from the University of Leeds, who has a bespoke accessories business called Delilah's Dressing Room. She created an innovative mask that she's sold and donated all over the world, and it started because she wanted to help a member of her family. Delilah's father-in-law has an infrastructure critical profession and throughout the pandemic has had to be physically present at his job. But as a Sikh gentleman who has a long beard and wears a turban that covers his ears, a disposable surgical mask or its cloth equivalent was never going to fit him properly. As a design professional, she could solve the problem herself. But Delilah was essentially asking a question, often asked at the virtual reference desk. How do I make a mask for someone who can't wear a standard mask? To come up with the answer, Delilah went to her studio and created a mask with long straps to fasten around a turban and with a large pocket for the wearer's beard, so that her father-in-law would have properly fitting virus protection while looking professional in the workplace. She posted an image of her father-in-law on Instagram, and there was an immediate explosion of interest, including by the BBC, where I first saw her remarkable story. She received a rush of orders for the mask and became an official mask supplier for the West Yorkshire Police Department. She adapted the masks for climates far warmer than that of Britain, in different fabrics, and for different kinds of professional workplaces. Her local art museum, the Bradford Museum and Art Gallery, now has Delilah's mask in its two original colors. The Leeds Museum has requested the original mask Delilah made, and her father-in-law has promised to donate it to the museum as soon as he's done wearing it. The Birmingham Museum, which was very interested in how religious and ethnic minorities in Britain adapted during the pandemic, has the mask on permanent exhibition in their industrial gallery, and the National Science Museum in London is also acquiring the mask. I was a bit startled to learn from Delilah that her mask is not going into fashion museums, but instead seems to be considered more as industrial design and scientific design. But it certainly makes sense in the context of greater pandemic material culture. The National Science Museum also acquired the first vial of the vaccine that was distributed outside of a clinical trial. So Delilah's mask will be displayed alongside other objects of historical importance during the pandemic, with her mask originally made visible via social media. Since the start of the pandemic, fabric face masks are typically found in variations of one of three different basic designs: a pleated mask, which is essentially the cloth equivalent of a disposable surgical mask, a center seam mask with either a continuous center seam or two shorter ones, or a so-called 3D mask with fold-out flaps that go over the nose and over the chin. All of these designs have their benefits and drawbacks, and a German designer named Iris Luckhaus set out to design a better mask pattern, one that would also work well for glasses wearers like herself. Luckhaus studied clothing design at the Universität der Künste in Berlin and under the legendary Vivienne Westwood, and she takes great care to post patterns and instructions in both English and German. Luckhaus is very versatile in her professional practice, and she uses historical clothing construction techniques to inform her design. I first came across Luckhaus's mask design as a mask maker myself, looking for ideas on Twitter. It incorporates the breathability and flexibility of a pleated mask, the gapless fit of a center seam mask, and the nose flap from the 3D mask to keep the wearer's glasses free of condensation. As I was very much not trained by Vivienne Westwood, I was intrigued but intimidated by Luckhaus's pattern, which is significantly more complex to construct than other patterns. But by following the very detailed recommendations on her website, I soon got the hang of it, and my friends and family absolutely raved about the Luckhaus masks I made for them. Luckhaus is happy to sell a commercial mask license to professional profit-seeking garment creators, but for those like me who are sewing for their friends and family, she provides patterns and instructions on her website for free, and she has created mask patterns in different sizes and for different shapes of nose and chin. She also welcomes home-based mask makers to post their versions of her mask on social media with the hashtag #LuckhausMask. As an art historian, I thought, okay, I understand this now. Luckhaus's mask patterns are like Thomas Chippendale's cabinet maker's director. Chippendale sold a book of furniture designs in the 18th century, and Luckhaus is publishing mask patterns online in the 21st. As a cabinet maker in Boston made a Chippendale chair, so will I make a Luckhaus mask. We're all making things very specifically designed by someone else and purposefully intended to be created by others around the world. But what Luckhaus and I have today that the men in the white powdered wigs did not is Twitter. So I took to my small corner of the art history Twitter sphere and tweeted a photograph of my friend Omar wearing a Luckhaus mask that I made for him from a specialty Luckhaus pattern for wearers who have a short beard. Luckhaus saw my tweet and kindly offered a suggestion as to how to fit the mask to make it more effective. It is quite remarkable to note here that I, as the creator of an object, and Omar, as the person wearing the mask, actually received timely, helpful feedback from the original pattern designer. That is a remarkable level of teaching and learning behavior. A Boston cabinet maker had no possibility of getting feedback from Thomas Chippendale, and not just because he would have communicated with the speed of a letter over the Atlantic instead of the speed of a signal bounced off a satellite. It's not just the speed of communication in the 21st century, but also the element of altruism and spirit of radical community service that has been awakened in so many during this difficult time. Arguably the first major image, perhaps first widely shared piece of pandemic material culture that became widespread in early 2020 was a photograph of hospital workers wearing scrubs and masks, holding the signs reading, "We stay here for you, please stay home for us." But for those of us who are staying at home, many of us felt something that was best described by Jane Austen in the novel Sense and Sensibility, specifically, "Give me an occupation or I shall run mad." I approached Iris Lacasse again, not as a mask maker, but as an art historian, and she shared with me her process in designing masks, her desire to be of service, and her intellectual and artistic curiosity. She speaks excellent English, and these are her edited words, not my translation. "I started to dive back into my own pattern cutting and enjoyed to have yet another interesting pattern problem to solve, one which I've never even considered before. How do we dress the human face? To me, good design is always functional, in a way that every tiny detail has to have a reason. When I heard that even doctors and nurses were sent to work without protection, I just couldn't bear the idea. Wondering how to help them, I thought the least I could do was to publish my exceptionally well-fitting design, to enable them and anyone else in need to sew it. I had something to contribute to the fight against COVID, so that's what I did." Lookhouse spends a great deal of time and effort meeting people where they are, which during the pandemic is Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Pinterest, and LinkedIn. In her words on her own contribution to the online mask library, "I think it's not only the mask that help us fight this pandemic, but also helping one another as humans. In these groups, my pattern was welcomed with overwhelming enthusiasm and a whole lot of detailed questions. Since then, I've been spending every free minute helping the helpers to help, and by trying to answer every single question." In the physical museum art library, it's not unheard of for authors or artists to give copies of their publications to the library. But the kind of communication between Lookhouse and those who use her patterns is made possible by existing in a virtual space and the person-to-person communication enabled by social media. The Auntie Sewing Squad was created in early 2020 by Christina Wong, a professional performance artist based in Los Angeles. With her live performances on hold during the pandemic, Wong began sourcing materials and making masks for healthcare providers in Los Angeles, many of whom were forced to go without adequate PPE. And she took to Facebook to, in her words, flag down some help, and founded an 800-person strong organization. They do not sell masks, they only donate masks for free. As medical masks gradually became available to healthcare providers, the Auntie Sewing Squad shifted their mission to providing homemade cloth face masks for vulnerable communities. They use a massive network of contacts online and offline to identify at-need groups and provide them with homemade masks or other safety supplies. This network includes friends and relatives, prisoner outreach organizations, nonprofits, food banks, organizations that assist asylum seekers at the border, migrant farm workers, Native American nations, and many others. Members of the sewing squad make masks knowing generally where their masks are going, to children in foster care, for example, but they do not typically know the individuals who will receive their masks, which is a very different experience than those making masks for friends and family. A common thread in the group is using the materials that go into the mask to communicate with the eventual recipient. Often the materials are very personal to the creator and go to the root of their desire to help people they don't know. Members of the Auntie Sewing Squad shared with me their personal stories of mask makings to share online in this workshop. They are best described in their own words. Auntie Sandra Heese remarked upon the personal therapeutic aspect of mask creating, saying, "I had no idea how huge a part of my life and major coping mechanism mask making would become for me and the awe-inspiring Auntie Sewing Squad community. The embroidered heart covered a hole in the fabric that I missed while constructing. It became a metaphor for the whole endeavor, covering faces with love." Auntie Sylvia Kwan remarked of these masks she made for inmates at San Quentin Prison. "Sending masks to incarcerated people made me feel incredibly grateful to be part of ASS. While sewing these masks, I frequently thought of Chol So Lee, who was on death row there. His wrongful murder conviction in 1973 led to a national pan-ethnic Asian American social movement." Auntie Beth Mathieson, a professional chef, said, "I was out of the kitchen for 13 months, so the first fabric I used was upcycled from a bunch of my old chef coats. And because they were basic white, I got to experimenting with tie-dye as well. Looking back on this, it looks rudimentary, the pattern isn't great, my sewing skills weren't very refined, but I was still damned proud of this work. Joined this amazing community a few months later, learned a ton, changed up the pattern, honed my skills, and now I'm approaching 500 masks for Auntie-related pledges. This mask was made by Gwen Wong, the mother of Christina Wong, who stated, "This mask was made from fabric donated by a Buddhist temple in Northern California. They had an excess supply of new monk robes and generously donated some to us. This mask went to a farm worker. I hope this mask, with its blessed beginnings, kept the wearer safe." There is a tremendous variety aesthetically among the thousands of masks made by the Auntie Sewing Squad, but they are all made very purposefully and through volunteer labor, and although they are unsigned art, the materials and methods of construction are often very important to the maker. As in many other mask-making endeavors, the presence of donors is invisible. Wong received a massive number of financial donations, but as she made very clear when we spoke, this problem could not be solved by money. It could only be mitigated by hard work and radical acts of community service. Many aunties, such as Christina Wong herself, were sewing masks for 10 and 12 hours a day. The Auntie Sewing Squad is very conscious of recording history and has their own in-house historian, Rebecca Solnit, who is a published author of over 20 books. Although the group was largely formed and mostly communicates online, they will soon enter the analog world through their upcoming book, The Auntie Sewing Squad Guide to Mask Making, Radical Care, and Racial Justice, soon to be published by the University of California Press, which will then become part of the physical library space and eventually the in-person reference desk interview. Sunni Delilah, Iris Lookhouse, and Christina Wong are examples of people who adapted their years of professional experience into COVID-era community service. Delilah understood the needs of a niche community and was able to keep them properly protected. Lookhouse dedicated her free time to making a series of superbly fitting patterns and making sure anybody who wanted to make one had the chance to ask her for help, and in 2 languages. Wong used her skill as a performer to communicate across communities and across generations, to rally a group of hundreds to make masks for people they will never meet. These 3 women helped others on a monumental scale, but they are also representative of what millions have been doing for the last year and a half, using many forms of communication to learn how to create masks and then get them where they need to go. Although the process of mask making is different for each small-scale creator, there's a basic pattern of artistic information seeking and disseminating behavior that is often repeated with the great spirit of community service and the search for joy and laughter to help get through these difficult times. Step 1, identify the research question. How do I make a mask? 2, what materials do I need and how do I obtain them? 3, search for assistance. Step 4, become proficient making masks and recognize the therapeutic aspect in being of service during a global crisis. Step 5, become an effective librarian and offer advice and assistance to other less experienced mask creators. The final step of this process, becoming an ersatz librarian by helping other mask makers gain confidence in their sewing, is best summed up by a line in Wong's one-woman online play, Christina Wong's Sweatshop Overlord. A sewing machine is just a fancy stapler. Pandemic material culture is still very much being created and the work of the online reference library continues, but at this moment in time, I'd like to extend my most heartfelt thanks to Sunni Delilah, Iris Lookhouse, Christina Wong, and the rest of the Sewing Squad for helping me share their story of how their hard work, innovation, and good humor have helped keep so many people safe.
Thank you very much, Serena. Next speaker is Sarah Rothwell from the National Museums of Scotland. Her presentation has the title, The Emotional Power of Masks, Collecting Intangible Heritage.
Well, hello everyone. I'm Sarah Rothwell, Curator of Modern Contemporary Design at National Museum Scotland in Edinburgh. And thank you for joining us today for this in-conversation on the emotional power of masks as part of Icon Clothing the Pandemic workshop. Over the last year, we've all experienced huge changes in our lives due to the necessary adoption of wearing masks as part of a global identity. So it was only natural for many artists, makers, and designers to use these facial adornments as a vehicle to spread messages and discuss the emotional impact of the situation. And in turn, I, as did many others, soon became fascinated with the history of masks and those contemporary artists, makers, and designers whose practice sought to explore them as part of a wider discourse on non-conformative identity, heritage, and socio-political discussion. So I'm very pleased today to be joined by two artists who over the last year captivated me during my own period of isolation and continue to do so via their Instagram platforms, and are part of a growing group of international artists and makers who are receiving acclaim for how they have tackled the emotional impact of the situation through the art of masks. The Irish visual artist Thread Stories, whose practice explores the erosion of personal privacy in the digital age and how it shapes how we view and portray ourselves online via a series of beautiful, if sometimes grotesque, masks that have a deep emotional resonance to them. And the Icelandic artist Auntie, whose practice is based on marrying traditional craft skills with sustainable production and recycling, often working with secondhand clothing, which she brings new value to by adding her hand-knitted, quirky, whimsical, and colourful creations that during the pandemic extended to the form of masks. So welcome, both of you. I'd like to start by discussing the motivation around the masks, making of your masks, Breathe and Stay Away Braces edition, created at the start of the lockdown, in your case, Thread Stories, in March 2020, and the end of the year for you, Auntie, in December. Which National Museums Scotland have acquired. If I can start with you, Thread Stories, I personally felt a deep emotional connection to your performance of Breathe. As an asthmatic, I really resonated with the feeling of trepidation I saw in your eyes. So I'd love to learn more about what you were feeling at that time and how you chose to distill this into this piece.
Thank you, Sarah. I suppose, like most people at the time in March 2020, there was just a huge amount of fear and a huge amount of focus put on our breath, breathing, everything from visuals on the news to radio programs about, you know, what can be carried on our breath. It just seemed to be this onslaught of kind of fear around, you know, the distance you keep from people. And you know, we all kind of, well, I suppose I can only speak for myself, but that sense of, you know, what was once something that, you know, if in a moment of anxiety or stress, you would say, you know, focus on your breathing, take a breath, all of a sudden became something that felt quite fearful. Like, you know, if you're out for a walk, you got quite concerned if people got too close to you and were talking to you, because you became aware of, from all this kind of media, and rightfully so, but and so with that mask, like all my masks, and it wasn't the first time I had explored anything to do with breathing, but it became so important and so like of the moment for me, just to put on that mask and I suppose animate our breath and to create something that was almost this invisible kind of enemy. I suppose not enemy is the wrong word, but just something that we were became quite fearful of, our breathing and what can be carried on it. And I suppose in this, with this mask animated, it makes the invisible visible, and it just felt right at the time.
Yeah, because there's something very visceral about how those silver entrails move. And actually, when you're watching the performance, the resonance of your breath and how it's halting almost because of your anxiety.
Yeah, definitely. You know, and it's incredible. People will bring their own filter to the work. And, you know, like you made the point of being asthmatic, how you saw it in one way. And you know what, I feel like I can only take the work so far, and then the viewer takes over with whatever is in their lives. And breath is something that's completely universal. So, you know, it's one of those things that people, and I'm more than happy for people to find their own kind of meaning in it. But for me, that's what I was thinking at the time.
Yeah, thank you. And you, Auntie, you mentioned that you looked to start creating masks as a means of escape from the isolation that you were experiencing at the start of your own lockdown. Do you think the kind of joyous whimsy of your practice helped you regain that feeling of connection with others by creating the masks?
Yeah, also because of the lockdown, I shared them online, so it was also like the online platform became quite important in COVID because you could connect more easily with people there. And yeah, it was like a fun tryout that I had never worked with a mask form before. So it grew in the first weeks of COVID, and I think like the humor behind the masks definitely we needed a bit of laughter at this point of time. So I think that was the main point with my mask, was just to lighten the mood a little bit, and I think it worked because people got very excited for the masks.
Yeah, I was about to say, because it's interesting you mentioned, because you both use digital platforms to kind of present your work to your audiences. So do you feel, was there kind of surprising responses from your community in relation to those masks? Because I know, for instance, we're not the only museum that acquired your masks. You kind of were picked up by quite a number of individuals.
Yeah, I think it was not planned that it would be like this. It was supposed to be because I had just moved to a new studio when COVID started, and I had been preparing a really big show for Design March in Reykjavik that got delayed, and so I ended up, it was kind of just meant to be now also in a new studio, doodles to just hang up in the studio, just to have something fun and small things. And the mask form became such a new accessory and that we had to wear. So it's just, I think it's just so interesting when things like that happened. It was not planned at all. It just kind of existed all of a sudden. So yeah.
Yeah, because masks is unlike with Thread Stories and whose masks are part of your practice for a number of years, for yourself, this was very much a new venture. Do you think I know obviously when we discussed Stay Away, you said this was kind of the closing of 2020 for you, but do you think you will keep making masks?
I have actually been thinking, when I was making the face masks, I did realize of course my, what I do in my practice, it fits the face really well because I'm kind of playing with facial expressions on sweaters. So of course it worked out. But I think I have been thinking of doing more pieces that are more hoodie, beanies or something, or more in the direction of Thread Stories actually, more of the balaclavas, not necessarily the face mask form. I think I'm done with that completely.
It was interesting that there's potentially there for progression, because obviously there's something quite fun and whimsical about your additions that I love the fact that they kind of inspire communication and kind of conversation as well. Did you find that when you went out wearing your pieces? Because I know obviously you mentioned in Iceland it wasn't mandatory to wear masks during the pandemic.
Yeah, I actually didn't wear them myself that much. Some of my friends wore them. I'm too shy to wear my stuff in public actually.
Did they then have good interactions with people then when they wore them?
Yeah. Or I think people, this stuff was a bit weird. Icelanders are quite closed people. They don't really show expressions, so it's really hard to know what they're thinking. So yeah.
Well, so Thread Stories, obviously you've been using masks as a vehicle to explore and tackle really emotionally charged subjects for several years now. Can you explain to the audience why you chose masks as the medium in which to kind of create these dialogues with?
I think they kind of found me. My background is sculpture, so each mask to me is an exercise in form, color, and movement. So I very much see them as sculptural forms that are kind of malleable and pliable. If you look at my work, I use the same masks over and over again, but I reshape them and brush them and preen them and cut them and chop them. So for me, they're all kind of exploration of that kind of sculptural form. And I just think there's something quite interesting about work that's made, the body a sight. And especially the head, because you can start to kind of deal with what's inside, what's outside. It's the face, the mind, you can start to use that as your ground for ideas. So the head as sight and creating sculpture forms. So I suppose they are masks, but maybe I just don't think of them in such a kind of yeah, you know, a lot of people said to me when COVID started, oh, what do you think of everyone wearing masks now? And I suppose I didn't see much of a correlation between these masks for protection and what I did. You know, not all masks are the same. They have many different functions. So I was making a mask to go to a music festival years and years ago. I couldn't figure out how to make it. And one morning I just woke up and thought, well, you know, what if I was to crochet a balaclava and then start to feed thread through all the stitches, and I'd get this big form. And you know, I went about making it. I'd never made anything like that before. I hadn't used textiles throughout my studies or anything like that, and I just became completely absorbed and engrossed in that process and just thought I could do this a million times, a million different ways. And it's just been a compulsion for the last 5 or 6 years. So that's how Thread Stories began. You know, I didn't set out to be a mask maker or anything like that.
It's an interesting, yeah, because obviously, as you say, masks have been used as a performative adornment for centuries, and it's to kind of almost disguise an individual, but also then actually can be used as this canvas to kind of display emotions upon it when through decoration. And it's interesting, both of your masks are doing that. You're using it as a canvas to explore really differently charged emotional feelings. In your case, obviously, Thread Stories, that kind of anxiety and despair within the uncertainty in this piece, Breathe. And with you, Ari, in Stay Away, the much more kind of humoured kind of nuances of our relationships with people that we're missing. I was kind of intrigued the fact that, you're both, even though, sorry, as you say, you're not from a textiles background, but you are both basically, your practice is based around traditional craft processes and techniques. And do you think that helped you when you were actually kind of creating your masks to convey these different kind of emotions?
From my point of view, does textiles help to create or to convey emotion? I'm not sure. Yeah, like there, you know, there's something so, you know, warm and homely and maybe domestic about the techniques, and then they're subverted in the way we're probably both using them. So there is a comfort level there maybe with people. You know, it's not a mask made from kind of wood or anything like that. There is something quite like you do want to reach in and touch them and know what they feel like. So, you know, that helps with the emotive element, I would say. Yeah. From my point of view, maybe,
Yeah, it's also so because I use this like old technique, but I'm kind of breaking the tradition a bit in my work. And yeah, it was also just really like I think I feel very lucky that this is my medium and COVID hit, because it was the perfect thing to be doing. Was to be home knitting and doing something like I could keep on working. Like COVID didn't really affect my work that much. If anything, it like lifted me up when I think about it. So yeah, I don't know if it's the answer to the question, but
no, it's interesting because as you both mentioned the fact that the process helped you kind of relieve that anxiety through creation. And I think that's also then distilled within the pieces, and you feel those emotions within those work because of how your practice was actually helping you cope with the situation. And I think it's quite pertinent because I see both your masks as a visual representation of 2020 for myself, because within yours, obviously Thread Stories, it's about the anxiety many of us were feeling right at the start of the year. And then with yourself and Stay Away, it's that kind of need, as you mentioned, to kind of reclaim joy and humor. So I'd be quite intrigued to kind of hear if you have seen any other masks that you've seen have kind of like also been exploring these subjects of emotion during the COVID situation, and that you were kind of inspired by as well. Sorry, you're a little bit stacked.
Say that question again, sorry.
I was just wondering, because I see both of your masks as kind of tail ends of 2020, had you seen any other artists or makers who have been creating masks that you think have encapsulated that emotional charge that we were all feeling as well within their masks?
On the spot. I would have to like scroll my save stuff on Instagram or something to find something.
That's okay. Was there any other practitioners, Carrie, that you were interested in during this kind of pandemic as well?
Yeah, you know, you've kind of caught me there because I don't know if I look to other mask makers, even though I enjoy other mask makers' work. You know, I would probably be more inclined to, you know, look at illustrators or paint. You know, I wouldn't necessarily be that focused on other mask makers for, yeah, so I actually can't think of any. I'm sure there's absolutely tons. But off the top of my head, apologies, nothing is coming to mind.
That's okay.
But you know, there was just incredible work that was being made in the moment that was going up on social media, left, right, and center by all sorts of different people, and it really was the year of masks, wasn't it? You know, there was a lot of people for the first time making masks, like you said, and it was actually just like really amazing to see all the different iterations and incredible kind of imaginative responses that people were having. But so I kind of enjoyed all of them. I enjoyed watching all of them. Yeah,
like I follow fashion for backrubbers. That's like it's an Instagram account called Fashion for Backrubbers.
Fashion for bank robbers. That sounds interesting. I've not heard of them. I will have to look out for them.
There's like where you find all the masks. Yeah. So yeah, I think like that's where I at least probably noticed most of the masks, and there were some also like competitions going on in Covet, or kind of like showing the most like creative kind of masks, and there were like a lot of like really well crafted, like beautiful masks that I saw. But I can't remember who made what, though. There were like too many.
No, it's interesting, as you both say, that I think because of this new global identity and ownership of masks now, people have become more interested in the craft of making them and actually kind of exploring them as a vehicle for artistic expression. And I'm just very honoured that I've been able to acquire both your masks for the National Museum Scotland's collection, because I do find them deeply moving, and they have personally resonated with me, as I mentioned, because of the narratives that they've explored. So I would want to thank you again for allowing me to acquire them, and also for your time today and your insight into the kind of making of the masks. And yeah, how you kind of see masks, and yeah, how you started making them as well. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much, Sarah.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you for Dido. So if you can continue, I would like to ask Ms. Anatelli and Claire Elkerton. They're both MA students from RCA, and Victoria and Albert from London. And please, the floor is yours.
All right, well, thank you so much for coming to our presentation. My name is Anatelli, and I am one of the founders of Design in Quarantine, which is an online archive that collects real-time design responses to the COVID-19 pandemic.
And I'm Fleur, the other founder of Design in Quarantine. And we would like to thank you all for coming to our workshop today, a toolkit for crisis, and for the Icon Costume Committee for asking us to present. This presentation is in two parts, the first being an overview of our digital archive Design in Quarantine, and the second part will consist of a digital toolkit, which we hope will help you all in digital rapid response initiatives at your own institutions.
So part one, Design in Quarantine. So at the start of the pandemic, we were both MA History of Design and Material Culture students at the V&A and Royal College of Art in London. Fleur specializes in medieval Europe and its interactions with the Islamic world, focusing on technology, performance, and nature. And my work focuses on the history of modern and contemporary design, particularly graphics and communication. And we had a shared interest in the digital humanities, which Fleur in particular had cultivated during a semester-long exchange at the Bard Graduate Center in New York. And our MA program also had a focus on design history as public practice and actively cultivates an interest in public-facing research. So out of this environment, and with the pandemic causing the closure of museums and libraries, forcing a shift upon traditional research methodologies, design and quarantine was created. So familiar with Elizabeth Yale's essay, The History of Archives, the State of the Discipline, we considered perspectives on archiving from several different figures when planning design and quarantine structure and aims. And we were heavily influenced by Foucault's definition of archiving, who considers the entire underlying foundational system in the creation of histories and discourses as the archive. And Foucault's broader definition allowed us to prod at some of the issues surrounding what we would typically consider as the static and solid documentary archive, particularly as Design in Quarantine was constructed in real time alongside the discourses that would form the historical foundation of the pandemic. So using the technique of what Kristen Weld calls thinking archivally, we approached Design in Quarantine critically through the questions: what is an archive? How is it created? What power structures are embedded? And whose stories does it tell? And these questions allowed us to recognize our own bias, as well as gaps in collecting projects more generally. Representing different narratives within pandemic design discourses, such as the marketing of false products and Kate Wagner's critique of design media's promotion of conceptual projects, has enriched the story of COVID design by complicating progressive narratives. And this complication is essential to fully portraying the role of design during the COVID crisis. We began talking about the project just after the UK went into lockdown, and we were wondering how we could respond as historians to something that was happening in the present. And after discussion, we thought the best way would be with a rapid response archive. So within 2 weeks of having talked over our initial ideas, we decided on a name and secured a web domain, worked out a design for the website, and launched. And we felt that it was particularly important to have the archive live as soon as possible due to the volume of work that was being covered in the press and what we saw on our own social media feed. And using, again, Kirsten Weld's call to think archivally, we approached Design in Quarantine critically through the questions: what does it mean to start a digital archive? How do historians respond to contemporary crises? How can we make living history as accessible as possible using digital methodologies? And how can we provide a platform for designers, both now and in the future, to educate themselves on the ways in which design can respond to a public health crisis? So we quickly drew up our initial rationale, outcomes, and collections manifesto. And the core of our purpose was in the rationale, which stated, quote, "We hope that this living archive will serve as an inspiration to designers looking to change the course of the pandemic through design-based initiatives. It will also serve as a record of how the field of design responded, simultaneously highlighting a shift in design historical practice and creating a resource for future generations." We did not see each other physically throughout the entire creation of the archive, and all communication was done through Google Drive, WhatsApp, and Zoom. And it wasn't until August of 2020 when we finally met again in person, and we still find it sort of surreal that we were able to run the entire project digitally. Our methods have made us reflect on both the benefits and challenges of researching and working purely on digital platforms. And this is something we hope historians more widely will take time to reflect on as the pandemic continues to shape the field. We also developed a digital toolkit to help us promote our platform to the public, which we'll expand on in part 2 of this presentation. And this included our hosting platform, Cargo, our social media scheduler, which is called Later, our ever trusty email inbox, and Canva and Photoshop that helped us create our visual assets. And we also figured out Creative Commons licensing to help enable us to use certain images on our platform. And we set up a form submission so design responses and works could be sent directly to us.
So based on the technique of rapid response collecting, which we have first-hand knowledge of being based at the V&A, and we'll discuss a little bit more as part of our toolkit, our archive is constantly growing and evolving. Our aim was to collect a range of responses across different design disciplines, including but not limited to graphics, architectural concepts, product, furniture design, and bespoke craft, which could also be wearable. This means there's lots of stuff to archive. So therefore, it was really important to us to make the website as simple to navigate and as objective as possible. And one of the questions we asked ourselves when designing the navigation of the site was, how can we create taxonomies beyond type and make large claims about works when the event is unfolding around us? So in an attempt to combat implicit biases and to consciously reject taxonomic hierarchies, we designed the website to randomize the entries displayed on the homepage each time an individual visits. We also restricted sorting the entries into 6 broad categories, providing only a base level of organization. This randomization and looseness in our site can be seen to reflect the chaos of the world as it came to grips with the pandemic. As Icon magazine described us, a disorderly archive is perhaps the sincerest record of our history. The language of our labels is also clear and is close to museum quality wherever possible. We wanted simple and helpful information rather than complex opinions. And we'd also be interested to display labels in multiple languages and in alphabets if submitted in that format. We knew that the pandemic period and the designs it generated would be of interest to future design researchers. So hence the idea of constructing a simple digital archive that could serve as a resource. But also the digital afterlives of the collections in our now very virtual world was something which concerned us, as so many websites are so ephemeral. So we made sure that our site was saved on the Wayback Machine and applied for it to be archived by the UK Web Archive, which means now it is. So that means that it's available on site in the Bodleian Library in Oxford, the Cambridge University Libraries, Trinity College Dublin, and the National Libraries of Scotland, and also the British Library. The Design History Society's Virtual Student Award has also helped us to secure another year's worth of hosting. Since the project's launch in April 2020, we've now collected over 450 works, which we believe are integral to representing the evolution and the variety of design responses to the coronavirus pandemic. Collected, conceptualized, and living in the now, the digital archive will continue to function beyond the end of the pandemic when used as a research resource in the future. It engages socially, culturally, and intellectually with relevant research questions for both practitioners and historians in the design community during the global pandemic. We believe that our public archive holds the inspiration to answer many of the most pressing questions in the realms of public health, the environment, work, and society. And we aim to show that history is not always in the past, it is happening now, and that design in quarantine can be part of the evolving story of COVID-19 now and in the future.
So on to part 2, which is our digital toolkit. So we've created this toolkit around 5 key actions you could take as an individual or a small team or a large institution to respond in the event of a crisis based on what we've learned through creating design in quarantine. However, we would like to stress that some of these actions can and maybe should be applied even without a crisis necessarily looming on the horizon. And we hope that you might find something useful from these 5 actions, and do look forward to any questions that you may have, which I'll now say you can direct to us at our emails, which will be on the final slide, as we will not be able to be here for the Q&A. So step 1, be responsive. So this means not only voicing an acknowledgement of the situation, whatever that situation might be, but actually taking an often physical action as an institution to respond to the event, centering your community and audience in your work, whether that be through collecting or even opening up your museum space to those in need. So one of the methods institutions can utilize to be responsive is rapid response collecting, as we've mentioned before. We believe rapid response collecting, both digital and physical, is an amazing way to engage with local communities. It's a key way of grounding the institution as a pillar of public support in a time of crisis. There's lots of literature about this as well. Fleur and I employed rapid response collecting in design in quarantine, which was adapted from the V&A's rapid response collecting practice, which is employed by the Design, Architecture, and Digital Department. This type of collecting was introduced in 2014 to allow for acquisitions that are, quote, in response to major moments in history. As a practice, rapid response collecting can increase community engagement and positions the institution as socially responsive. Visitors are able to relate to items on display and sometimes even actively participate in the collection process, such as the UK's Museum of the Home's Stay Home Collecting Project, which asks the public to answer 7 questions about themselves and their home, submit 5 photographs of their home, and share diary entries spanning 1 month of the pandemic. This material will be folded into the museum's larger Documenting Homes collecting project. By employing rapid response collecting and inviting the public to submit their stories, the curation of that collection becomes active within the larger community, both showing the museum's responsiveness to a time of crisis and allowing the community to be active in the collection process. Of course, there are challenges with rapid response collecting, and a common problem is that there's just simply too much to collect, particularly when inviting the public to submit. One way of alleviating this issue is to be very precise with the scope and aims of your collecting project and being extremely specific to the public about what type of material you're looking to collect. Another challenge is that you're choosing objects sort of before their time and before you know their true impact and historical relevance. If your institution has the infrastructure, you could catalog objects as part of temporary collections and decide later whether to fully accession the objects. You might have to reflect on what your you also might have to reflect on what your institution defines as historical material, and maybe your community's understanding of historical objects in order to help define the kind of material you're looking to collect as part of a rapid response initiative. And so sort of building off of the idea to be responsive, it's also crucial to adapt quickly and be agile as an institution when faced with a public crisis. So ask yourself if your institution has the measures in place to be able to adapt quickly to fast-moving situations, and if not, how you might be able to make both spatial and digital transitions easier if presented with an emergency. And you might take some of the following examples as inspiration. So for instance, the Museum of Homelessness in London, which has partners with the London homeless health teams, the government's Rough Sleepers initiatives, local partners in Islington, and grassroots groups across the UK, began to take immediate action to protect the homeless in their area. They began temperature screening at their weekly solidarity drop-in. They published a plan to utilize empty hotel accommodation for people who were homeless. They borrowed a vacant community center from the local council to launch a 7-day-a-week pandemic response operation, and even repurposed their museum shelving to serve as food bank storage. And they did all of this in 3 weeks.
So an example of how small and hyperlocal museums have quickly adapted to the pandemic is the Dava Powerhouse Museum in Cambridge in the UK. It was the house of a Victorian art worker who worked painting designs during the arts and crafts movement. And it's a very small space and is limited in terms of physical visitors to the museum. So when the pandemic hit, they were granted funding by Historic England and the Arts Council to establish some virtual tours of the house and to train staff and volunteers who weren't technologically literate in order to help with this. And as it's a very small organisation, they were able to make these changes really rapidly and adapt quicker than a lot of the other larger organisations and institutions. So this flexibility really helped them adapt to the pandemic and potentially beyond in future crises.
Another lovely example of adapting, last summer during the BLM protests in New York, the Brooklyn Museum opened its lobby as a resting place for demonstrators. It made itself available between 2 p.m. and 6 p.m. for activists to get out of the sun, use the restrooms, and charge their phones. And in doing so, the Brooklyn Museum emphasized its role as an essential institution for the community, not only through education, but by simply opening itself up as a gathering space.
And museums themselves can even serve as vaccination sites. So from April the 23rd, New Yorkers could be vaccinated under the 94-foot-long model of the blue whale at the American Museum of Natural History. And you can also get vaccinated in London at the Science Museum. So upskilling. It's a popular phrase in businesses today, and upskilling is the process of using additional training or education to build upon and advance your current skills. So it can apply to an individual as well as to an entire team or an organization, as long as you instill an evolving culture where everyone is always trying to learn and grow. So when thinking about upskilling to respond to crises, increasing digital skills in engagement, platform building, and social media are really key. And this is in addition to some evergreen skills like diversity training. All of these skills can combine to help enable local, national, and international collaboration. And these connections can be key when responding to a crisis of any scale. And these skills can and will change and evolve depending on the technologies available. So to take the pandemic as an example, those organizations which had upskilled previously in digital virtual technologies were able to respond and adapt slightly quicker. For instance, during the pandemic, organizations that also had a clear strategy on social media helped them to rapidly engage with their audiences online, even if they didn't have the kind of digital infrastructures on their own sites.
So an example of this is the Getty Museum Challenge, which is an excellent example of how the museum used its existing platforms like Twitter and Instagram to engage audiences by asking them to dress up like existing works of art. And here I tried to pick some examples that utilize the mask. An independent foundation, the World Around Conference took place in January 2021. It was an all-day conference featuring architectural innovations from all over the world. But instead of the Zoom sort of slideshows and talks we've all become accustomed to, the foundation sent crews on location and shot short films of each of the designers' work. So in effect, the conference kind of worked as a mini architectural film festival, which translated really well online with live Q&As at the end of each session. And then the designers also were able to keep the short films that they can now use as promotional material on their own websites. We'd also like to advocate for upskilling in digital technologies as they're related to preservation in a crisis scenario, particularly digital preservation. With Design in Quarantine, we learned a lot as we went along, and looking back, we wish we had put in place a more robust archiving and preservation workflow into the actual site itself, rather than relying on sort of external archives to archive our site sort of later on. So we suggest, if possible, you work in collaboration with a digital archivist who can help you define the exact processes that work best for your collections. And if you're interested in learning more about all of these processes yourself, the National Archives has a great initiative called Plugged in Power Up that has resources and workflows that I wish we had known about in April of 2020.
Okay, so the next step is reflecting, enriching, and evolving. So in times of crisis, museums need to constantly acknowledge their perspective, as your experience can be so different based on where you are in the world. Reflecting upon this is really crucial in order to enrich and evolve as a museum moving forwards in a time of crisis and beyond. So firstly, read and research out of your usual publications and media, especially ones only based where you live. So for example, we learnt this with Design in Quarantine. We tried to consciously choose to move beyond only design media outlets such as DZine or Design Boom, and tried to look at a variety of sources such as international newspapers to find examples of responses that we can include in the archive. We also utilised social media as a tool for reflecting and evolving our practice and our collection. We used hashtags to search particular items, getting results from around the world in a second, allowing us to reach out to those people and their work directly. This helped to diversify the content of the archive beyond what would typically be featured in design media. And we also began to actively outreach for submissions on social media too, which led us to become more engaged with our audience and think more proactively about our collection process. Our archive is open for submissions, and we've received a number of designs from individuals, firms and studios all over the world. We think that's due to this method. So next, in order to reflect properly, you need to acknowledge your limitations, be they financial or geographical, etc., but you don't let them define your responses. So collaboration and sharing experiences with others allows you and your organization to expand your boundaries. So similarly, you have to try and take your time. In a crisis, ideas and opinions can take time to formulate, but if possible, you can still respond. This can be as simple as being mindful of how other museums or heritage organizations are responding. So take your time, research these, and let this feed back into your own team's practice. And when suitable, reach out to your audiences and to your public for feedback, and let that also influence and reflect the process of reflection. So did you make the right choices? What maybe would have been better in your response? And what can you learn and put in place for the future? One physical, quite simple example of reflecting and evolving on your display practices is seen here in the Welcome collection from their Being Human exhibition. We can see here on the right how the original label in silver was added to and adapted with a white label underneath. This updates this piece to the situation of the COVID crisis, not just to Ebola, and demonstrates how the museum reflected on the context of the crisis and then intervened with interpretation to directly respond.
All right, and finally, we have disseminating. So understanding how to communicate your initiatives to local, national, and international audiences can be a challenge for an institution setting out on their own. And this is where collaboration with local and global partners comes in. So creating focus groups at different levels to understand how communicating with your local community might be different than communicating with your global audience. You can work with community partners and foundations in the areas where you'd like to reach to help develop a communication strategy. So for example, if you're an institution in a city, I'm sure you have partners, with other local institutions that you can partner up with. And with social media, which is sort of the biggest way we think about disseminating work these days, you can be ambitious, but you don't have to let it overwhelm you. Hyper-local audiences can be really crucial to supporting museums, especially in difficult times. So don't get too caught up with pushing large-scale outreach if your story and your community is there for you locally.
So with Design in Quarantine, we knew we needed to be on social media platforms to disseminate our work, but we really tried to keep it simple. So we stuck to Instagram and Twitter, where we knew our audience was most likely to be, and we planned out calendars in advance, allowing content to auto-post, and therefore that meant that we could just jack up on daily comments and engagement. So at first, we actually simply copied over the label from our collection for our social media captions, but we've recently switched to actually editing that and asking questions of our audience to prompt further engagement, and it seems to be going well so far. Using Twitter and Instagram also underscores the importance we gave to using free, accessible platforms for the public and research community to interact with your material in your collection, and it allowed us to easily interact with our audiences. And dissemination is not a one-way process. Through disseminating our project, we asked our audience to engage, and then in turn, we were able to attract submissions and help the project self-perpetuate. In 2021, we also started a successful online newsletter, continuing our public outreach by providing updates about the archive and COVID-related design more broadly. We also have used the letter as a way to elevate the voices of those who've been affected by the virus, such as our May newsletter, which included a guest essay spotlighting India and links to mutual aid groups. So digital collecting and programming for museums has certainly taken off in the last year, but attention must also be paid to reaching those who are not digitally enfranchised during a time of crisis. It seems that arts and culture might help to close the digital divide, with many community partnerships now providing laptops and tools for older or more isolated people so they can access events. Specifically knowing your audience, their barriers to access and how to overcome these is key, and not really fully in the remit of museums. However, the empathy and skill sharing that can be generated by digital heritage projects and responses is noted in a study by the think tank, The Knowledge Exchange, which concludes that overall digital options for outreach can provide a more accessible and wide-reaching program. Not everyone will always be able to access this due to digital divides. However, this is always evolving, and the pandemic has shown us that and has accelerated the need for more work to be done here. Lastly, we just wanted to explore how we used outreach in our project beyond the archive itself. So we led a 3-day workshop at the Royal College of Art, which was called the Alt Archive, Alternative Archiving Workshop. This workshop aimed to break away from the traditional modes and concepts of archiving, exposing students to new ideas about collecting and preserving the material and the immaterial. Here are some of their responses. The aim wasn't for us to put our project center stage, but to collaboratively discuss and observe how participants responded to the different methods of archiving we presented, and trying to give them different prompts and different opinions.
So finally, we hope that by sharing this presentation with you all, we are continuing to disseminate the Design in Quarantine project, as well as share what we've learned in the process of co-founding the archive. And we thank you all for your time. And we look forward to any questions you may have. And here on the last slide, you can see our email addresses, as well as the website, email address, and social media handles for the project itself. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna and Fleur. So our last speaker is Blanca Cardenas from the National School of Anthropology and History in Mexico, and her paper is Putting a Face on the Virus Project in Mexico. Please, Blanca, the floor is yours.
Good evening. I'm very happy to be here, and I would like to thank the organizers of this event for inviting me to talk about this project. First of all, I have to say that the following project, with its according photographs and information, it's actually a collective project that has been developed during around a year. My colleague, Professor Carlos Davila, who is watching us right now, and we have been looking for information and working with the collection that today I'm going to share with you. But also this has been a collaborative project with artisans and indigenous communities in my country. So let's start with the beginning. What is a mask? For many, these objects are expressions of cultural diversity or good examples of folk art that occupies large exhibition halls in many museums around the world. However, ethnographic research has shown that masks are artifacts that embody different meanings according with their cultural context. When masks appear at carnivals or rituals, they can trigger laughter, fear, anger, or solemnity. According to Claude Lévi-Strauss in The Way of Masks, he said that there is a strong relationship between masks and myths because both are part of an ongoing dialogue among societies. For instance, masks are artifacts that evoke places and times that maybe won't fit with our empirical perception, but that embody human and non-human beings that exist around us. So to talk about masks, we need then to take into account three features. The first one is that masks are living art. When we describe the tension between tradition and modern, folk art takes an important place. Many people complain about the use of modern materials or new designs because traditions may be forgotten. However, masks and other examples of folk art have shown a creative way in which indigenous communities can relate to political realities, ecological concerns, and new desires. Specifically, masks are vehicles of alterity, which means that masks show the way in which people read or understand national and international politics, catastrophes, and world crises. Folk art is then in constant transformation and shows specific aspects of cosmopolitical debates. Therefore, we can definitely expect that this kind of art changes and adapts to new topics and controversies, such as COVID and the pandemic. The second feature is that masks are art that is meant to be used. A lot has been said about this, but ethnographic objects were not built to be exhibited in a gallery or to follow specific beauty standards. These objects were created to be used, whether on an everyday or a ritual basis. The selection of colors, shapes, and ornaments answers to a way of thinking about reality and a plan of use. When we talk about masks, a common question is, were they already danced? Which means that masks take agency when people wear them and dance with them. The third feature is that masks are a kind of communitarian art. Finally, I would like to stress that masks synthesize a very long tradition of knowledge and cultural heritage. Even if we mention the artisan's name, in this case, it may be even more important to think about his or her cultural or ethnical origins and how they became acquainted with the techniques for building this kind of art. In the pictures, you are seeing the Judea Cora with a mask that is called the Corona mask, where people dismiss the virus from their communities, so they are taking it out. So between March and May of 2020, many artisans in Mexico faced serious financial problems, mainly because they couldn't sell their crafts in the traditional markets. As a consequence, many of them started to offer their crafts on Facebook, despite the technological inequalities in the Wi-Fi signal failures and in many communities. Artisans created a new logic for promoting their work. In this context, my colleague Carlos Davila decided to contact different artisans around the country with the intention of helping them and giving them the opportunity to get an extra income during the quarantine. He established contact with many of them and asked them to design a mask that embodied the face of the virus SARS-CoV-2 responsible of the sickness COVID-19. And that was the only instruction. Please design a mask that embodies the face of the virus. How do you see the virus was the question. On May-June last year, he started to receive messages that the masks were ready, and this was the moment when he contacted me. At first, we didn't know what to do because the masks were so amazing, surprising, but sometimes terrifying. All of the objects that I'm going to show to you have a specific story behind. For example, one of the artisans took many months to finish the mask because he was having trouble dreaming about her. He usually dreams with the masks he creates, but in this case, the task was taking too long. Some others took inspiration on previous masks, while some others decided to copy in their own version the scientific images of the virus that were everywhere on the internet. Either way, the results were surprising. So we traveled around Mexico, picking up most of the masks. And this means that we had to cross sometimes very complicated roads and to travel to very far away villages. All of this happened in the middle of the pandemic. But the main purpose was to register the creative and technical processes. If possible, we wanted to really understand the meanings related with the masks, as well as the ideas involved in the action of portraying the virus according to specific cultural codes. At the end of 2020, we had an ethnographic collection related specifically to the virus. Objects that, as I just said, are somehow alive because they show in a material way a collective concern. Objects that were designed, in this case, as folk art, but maybe with the aim of using them in the next carnivals or rituals, whenever that happens. We didn't have a proper place to keep the collection, so the objects stayed at the National School of Anthropology and History in Mexico City. Nobody, because of the pandemic, nobody had access to the school, only the principal and some professors. So we thought that it was a safe place for the moment. There in the image, you can see the map of Mexico and the places where the masks come from. So let's start with the collection. Although we have now textiles and some other objects, I would like to focus today on the 12 masks we have collected. The first one is the COVID pig. In indigenous communities in Mexico, some diseases are associated with the consumption of foods that are not typical of the local diet. This is the case of the pork, whose meat can be dangerous if it is not treated with due respect. There is no surprise to see how the virus is shown as a pig then. Then we have the mestizo man. Since the first months of 2020, indigenous communities have been isolated, not only because they have serious shortages of doctors and hospitals, but also because in their imaginary, epidemics always come from the world of the white people and mestizos. In this mask, we can appreciate how a white man is carrying the sickness. We were very interested in the creative processes, so we have pictures in most of the cases of the masks before they were finished and how the artisans let their imagination flow. Now we have the Tanak face mask. With the rise of the disease, many textile artisans managed to adapt their designs to the face masks that became an indispensable part of everyday life in the times of the pandemic. The artisans of the Tanak ethnic group designed wood face masks that became very popular during the festivities of the death in November. Now we have the Devil of Teloluapan. This mask belongs to an ancient tradition of the indigenous and Afro-Mestizo groups in Mexico, who built these as a military strategy against Spanish colonial domination. In this mask, we can see the COVID-19 cells sprouting from the devil's face. The COVID skull. The image of the virus was quickly associated with death, of course. And in this mask, we see a human skull with the terrifying look that reflects the death that the SARS-CoV-2 has left in its wake. The evil jaguar mask. The people of Mixteca culture and language that inhabit Puebla, Mexico, preserve various dances where the jaguar is one of the main characters that embodies evil. In this mask, the how they call the jaguar, was decorated with diverse attires that portray disastrous characteristics associated to the COVID-19. The Green Devil. Once again, we encounter a creation that comes from the Afro-Mestizo people. This mask portrays a devil woman with a face infested with COVID-19 cells, two goat horns that add a demonic attribute, and horse hair as the hair of the mask. So we can see the horsehair in the pictures, and we will see this mask again in a short video at the end of this presentation. The Covet Bull. The dance known as Tastuanes stages a fight between the Apostle Santiago and the devil, who is incarnated in the body of a bull. In this mask, the COVID-19 virus shares its face between a bull and a skull with 2020 as the date. Cocolistli, in the region known as Huasteca, the indigenous population speakers of Nahua have named the epidemic Cocolistli, a word that refers to the sicknesses that arrived in Mexican territory from the hands of the Spanish conquerors. Nowadays, the COVID-19 is deeply related to the cocoliztli in the social imaginary. Actually, they still call it like that. The mask of power, sorry. The Icat communities live in the coast of southern Oaxaca, Mexico, and they are also known as Guaves. During 2020, their territory has been disrupted, not only by the effects of the SARS-CoV-2, of course, but also by the internal fights with the municipal government. In the month of June of 2020, 21 indigenous people were killed by their own neighbors, leaving more deaths than the ones left by the coronavirus. The COVID tiger. In some communities in the south of Mexico, these kind of masks of tigers, sometimes in yellow or green, are created for the rain request rituals in the month of May. Of course, this is one a bit different because it's embodying the COVID-19. And finally, we have the Afrocabit. This mask represents again the evil that proceeds from the white and mestizo populations. The agency of the mask is conjured by the devil, an ally of the Black people. We can see there Baltasar, the artisan, showing the mask in process. So we are pretty sure that the virus, as a biological or organic entity, cannot discriminate. The sickness has gone around the world almost without any limit. However, we are also sure that the social and cultural consequences of this same virus are diverse and sometimes unfair for many populations. This project has highlighted for us many situations. The first one is the economical crisis of many indigenous communities in Mexico. The second one is the importance of giving a chance to folk art as a valid way of knowing and reflecting on reality. And the third one, it's the importance also of thinking in an anthropological fashion and to see the many ways of understanding and living with the virus. It has been quite a journey to see how in some communities, people say that the virus will only attack the white urban people. Or for instance, the way in which traditional rituals have changed, planting COVID seeds or performing COVID dances and songs. We have collected these objects, but also testimonies and different ways of living the pandemic. We hope to continue with this research with the help of pre-graduate students in the following months, and maybe in 2022, present an exhibition in a local museum, or even in the place, in a small room in the school. For now, next August, we will open an academic seminar about art, anthropology, and COVID-19 with some of our colleagues in the school. And all the reflections developed in this seminar are going to be included at the end of this year in a book and in a website that will also display the collections that you just saw. So there you can see the masks in the table in the school and a small book we did for the project that will start in August. So now we can see a short video. I hope it displays well. Let me know if it's wrong. So I try to do it fast. So thank you. If you have any questions, I will be here. And I tried to show in the video some of the masks used by the main artisans. So thank you very much.